This is the Profit from Legal podcast. I'm your host, Noel Bagwell. Whether you've listened to the podcast from the first episode or you're tuning in for the first time, welcome. The Profit from Legal podcast is brought to you by Executive Legal Professionals, PLLC, also called Executive LP, an innovative virtual law firm based in Nashville, Tennessee. At Executive LP, we work with businesses to transform their legal support from a cost center to a profit engine. And that's what we talk about on this podcast. Our semi-monthly regular episodes and frequent interviews with interesting professionals bring our audience of savvy entrepreneurs and business decision makers useful insights for getting the most out of their legal support. Thanks for tuning in today. We'll be right back after this brief commercial message. Welcome back to another episode of Profit from Legal. I'm your host, Noel Bagwell. We've got another great interview episode for you today. And today my guest is Rabiah Coon, a project manager, comic, activist, and nonprofit volunteer who on her podcast, More Than Work, talks with guests about the pursuit of shared passions and hobbies or work that reflects their lives. She's just a wonderful person to talk to. I think you're going to get a lot out of the podcast today. So welcome to Profit from Legal, Rabiah.
Hey, thanks, Noel. Thank you.
Why don't you tell everyone just a little bit about you? I know I gave a brief introduction, but what should people know about you?
Well, I do a lot of different things, I guess, from my intro. First and foremost, I think I just feel like my purpose is to serve others, and I just do it in different ways through comedy, making people laugh, through a podcast, telling people stories. And I'm also in school right now getting a public leadership credential at Harvard Kennedy School, because I want to further that and be able to contribute to organizations that are service-based.
That's really great. So in your work can we talk about your work a little bit as a project manager? Because I think for my audience, which is, primarily entrepreneurs, small business owners, decision makers in businesses, they probably are interested in your work as a comic and an activist in that. But from a practical boots on the ground standpoint, maybe most interested in your relevant expertise as a project manager. Why does promoting profitability in the projects that you manage on a project to project basis, why is that essential or important? Or do you think that's the most essential thing?
I think it's important. I think that you can really, as a business owner, if you're hiring, for example, I work as an IT contractor. So people hire my company to build a product for them, usually a website, and they want it to do something. So I think the profitability part comes in because you think of what transactions you want your website to do. And it could be e-commerce, like you want them to buy something, or it could be like on your website, you have the scorecard, for example. So a transaction there would be somebody inputting their information and filling in the scorecard and getting the information back, right? On other websites, it could be other things. And so I think it really comes down to understanding the purpose and what you want your product to do, and then being able to really clearly state that so that someone can build it. Because a lot of times people will say they want something done and they won't have it narrowed down, and they'll also want 28 other things. And they'll start sending someone like me on a wild goose chase trying to figure out which thing they want to have built. And then eventually they end up over budget, not on time, and basically without resources. And so I think it's important for people to really be focused and try to do one or two important things at a time. And that will then reflect in like them getting returns on what they're doing, if that makes sense.
What you said reminded me of Greg McKeown in his great book, Essentialism, where he's talking about not going a millimeter in a million different directions, but instead picking one direction and going as far as you can with that. That I'm hearing you say that the real value of profitability is it gives you something to laser focus on, and anything that would take away from profitability might lead to mission creep in your projects, and you might not end up where you intended to go.
Yeah, that's fair to say.
So what are the big mistakes that you see clients making whenever you're managing the project? I mean, you alluded to a couple there, but are there any like mistakes of thinking or mistakes of behavior in particular that lead to those outcomes you mentioned?
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing is just in choosing the partner to work with. It's important to find someone who is going to help you and not be afraid to tell you, hey, you're going down the wrong path, or there's a better way to do this. And it's also important to work with someone who you can trust and you say, this is what we want done, and you let them do that. One thing that's super difficult for, especially in technology, is that someone will come to you with a solution, not a problem to solve. They'll come to you and say, this is going on and this is what we want done, but that might not be the best way to solve the problem. And so I think people don't find partners that will tell them that. They just find partners who will just blindly execute and won't ask them questions. I think also accountability is very important. And what I often have seen in different places is that there's no accountable person on a project team out, like from the client perspective or from the business owner's perspective. There are like stakeholders and business owners, but someone needs to really be the one who owns the decisions, who understands the vision, and who can articulate it clearly so someone else can take care and manage a project and build it. And I think especially the accountability part and just knowing who owns what and who to go to, because if there's no one there to answer a question and there's no one there to say yes or no, it's really hard on other people to try to like execute on a vision and make it happen. So I think those are really important things.
Yeah. Whenever I write service agreements for, for clients who are hiring independent contractors or companies to provide a solution, there's always that section of the contract where the service provider and the client each establish a representative, like an authorized representative, to speak on their behalf. So when you're using a well-written contract, that's almost baked into the cake, that kind of accountability that it goes through this person. They're the authorized representative for the business, and they're the ones who are responsible for either making those decisions or going back internally on their side of the deal to get the decision made, to get an answer, and then present it to the other person. So that you kind of have, I mean, it's awful to say, but you kind of have these bottlenecks, but the bottlenecks are not necessarily productivity bottlenecks or accountability bottlenecks. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Bottleneck's probably the wrong word to use.
Well, yeah, and they're not always a bad thing, because if you're getting to a right decision, because it gets really costly the minute you start doing something just completely off, or that's not within the initial scope, and then you don't ever achieve the scope. It's I don't know if you're familiar with the term gold plating as it applies to software. And
no, not as it applies to software. I've not heard that. I mean, generally I can conceptualize what I think that means, but can you unpack that a little bit for the audience?
Yeah, sure. So gold plating is the idea that, say, for example, there's a website and someone says, oh, I want to be able to show pictures of the product from 4 angles and I want people to be able to buy it. So that's the objective. But then a developer might say, oh, well, I can actually do this thing where it's like a 3D modeling of the product, and the person can customize the product and do all this cool stuff. And they build something that is really awesome, but they didn't actually achieve what the client wanted or needed, which was they have something in black and white and that's it. And you can buy one of those 2 things. They've created this kind of amazing experience for the customer that doesn't achieve the goal of the actual product that they were supposed to build. And basically now there's something that's not useful because they gold plated it. They just kind of threw a bunch of extra stuff on there that looked really great. It might seem really cool, but it's not doing what you wanted. And
like a luxury car showroom for an economy car, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Like you don't need that. Or it's even like saying, yeah, I need to buy a bicycle. And then, maybe someone's spouse says, oh, I want to get a new bicycle so I can ride to the store. And then the partner buys them like an e-bike that's all fancy and stuff. And they're like, no, I just really wanted this bike. And now I can't use this e-bike for some, you know what I mean? It's just kind of,
right.
Yeah.
I'm kind of laughing because I saw there's a British guy who's like a crazy inventor dude who has a channel on YouTube, and he had built this jet bicycle. It has like a jet engine on the back of it. And the thing looks like it's going to just fly apart, and it's hilarious. He goes and makes all these crazy inventions. He actually made a working hover bike out of like a couple of really large, it looked like fans with big motors. It's just really dangerous stuff. And I kept thinking, is this guy married? Like, why is his wife letting him do this? Like, why does he not have parents? Like, is his mom not calling him like, I saw your video on YouTube, you need to wear a helmet, because he's not. He's riding this thing down what looks like a small airfield runway,
at top speed, jets like fire flaming out of the back of this bicycle. And it's not even like a sturdy looking mountain bike. The thing has a basket on the front of it. Okay.
Oh man.
Small tires. And I'm watching this like this dude is going to die. But yeah, the gold plating thing, sometimes simplest is best, right? I mean,
yeah.
Occam's razor tells us, just a principle of good thinking and philosophy, that the simplest answer, all things being equal, is usually the correct one. So if someone comes to you, now I think as a service provider, a lot of times people come to me and say, I want this solution. And what they bring to me is, I want a simple one-page contract. And I say, whoa, wait a minute. No, you don't. I know you think you do. And I respect that. I respect that you're trying to do the right thing here. But what is it really that you're trying to accomplish? And for a service provider, it's important to listen to the answer to that question. It's important to ask the question and then really listen, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I'll tell you, one of the favorite parts of my job is when I get to do the planning and the discovery part of a project, because it's a good time to ask, okay, for me, I came from a product manager background, which is a little bit different than project, but not too different. But it was always the question is like, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And when you understand that and everyone's aligned on that, then you can start to have ideas about what the solution will be. And that's the fun part. But it's a matter of just continuing to ask questions and not being afraid to continue to ask questions. As far as my role goes as a project manager and a business analyst, really is what I do. But also for the client, it really helps them think about it. And maybe they'll surface something that they didn't even know they wanted or needed. I mean, Apple does that all the time. They'll provide something new in the iPhone that you're like, oh, this is kind of ridiculous. Why would I use this? And then a month later, you're using it. Oh, it solved a problem I didn't know I had. You know? And that's kind of a cool part. And that's kind of, I think, one of the good things is, yeah, someone comes to you and says, hey, I want a 1-page contract. You're all, well, wait, what do you need a contract for? Well, actually, it'll be 3 pages, but this will cover it. You know, and that's kind of the beauty of having a partnership with someone where you can tell them that, rather than you trying to shove everything to 1 page and not do a great job for them. Right.
Yeah, no, I just refuse. I just say, well, the contract is as long as it needs to be. I'm not going to pre-agree to an arbitrary length or page count or word count. I'm not going to make it any longer than it needs to be, but I'm not going to make it any shorter than it needs to be. It's kind of like Gandalf says in, what is it, Lord of the Rings, where he says, a wizard is never late. He arrives precisely when he means to. And I'm the same way with my word count. The contract is never too long. It's precisely as long as it needs to be. But I think that the contracts need to be written, and the they need to be written in order to correspond to the nature of the relationship, and the relationship needs to allow for back and forth. And so therefore the contracts need to allow for back and forth. And where a lot of that comes out for either product management or project management contracts, as far as I've seen, is in the statement of work. And what I'd like for my audience to know about what you do and how to implement these things that you're talking about is that when it comes time to laying down a contract with a professional who does this sort of work, you want to have a contract that has a well-defined statement of work. It specifically articulates what the scope of the project is, specifically articulates the timeline, the budget, the milestones, and even the process for acceptance of the deliverables, so that all of that is objective and verifiable. And you can go back to that time and again throughout the project and say, now you've said you wanted this, or that deviates a little bit from what we've got in the statement of work. Do you really want to pay for a change, or are you happy to continue on with the scope that we've agreed on? And that can really, I think, help pivot a conversation back to the original intention.
Yeah. I mean, the whole change request process has to be defined. And it has to be respected. And sometimes things will change. And that's the nature of business, really. And I mean, depending on who a customer is. But the thing that's important is, being able to have that discussion. Part of a project manager, what our role often is with scope is there's trade-offs. So you have this idea, there's like this theory of constraints. So you have time, money, and resources. Well, or sometimes like you replace that with quality, but basically if you want it fast and cheap, it won't be good, is one of the ideas, because it's going to take a certain amount of effort to get it to a good quality. For example, a build of something. But when you look at it from a project manager perspective too, we have a certain amount of time and a certain amount of budget and a certain amount of like resources to get things done. And so if you want to change scope as a client, then that's something else will have to give. Either you have to like not do something else or do less of something else or extend the time, which extends the money, things like that. And so that's something that people it can be a really good discussion where the client can say, oh, you know what, I see what you mean. Or it can be a really difficult discussion. But I think as long as there are regular checkpoints and people are communicating, you can avoid like really difficult situations because you have that person who is accountable in the SOW that is in touch and understands where the project's going.
These are great principles, but one of the things that I often do in the podcast is use like real world examples. So is there a story that you can share that kind of brings this into the realm of reality of how this has played out in your professional experience?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just thinking of like the best example off the top of my head. I was at Fossil, the watches and bags company, and I was a product owner then. So I was actually the client, and there was a team that was building the website as a website redesign who I actually am working for now. So it went in a full circle way for me. But when we were working on the Fossil website, there were specific requirements because it was kind of taking an old website and putting it on a new platform and making a new user interface, new designs and everything. And I remember this one specific thing that came up because it was such an annoying thing. And remember, I was working for who the client is at this point. And there was this option for the buttons to be black. And then first there was going to be orange was the thing, orange or white or black. And then someone didn't like the orange and wanted to change it. But this change, because it had been built so specifically because Fossil, the person who it was basically me, representing my company, kept saying they wanted these specific buttons. And the company building for us said, well, what about this? And thought about like making it more flexible or whatever. But no, they didn't want it more flexible. And then they came time to like change the color of the button. Everything was kind of hard coded at that point. And it caused like more effort, more time, more money, all that. And there were probably 1,000 cuts like that on that project where it just kept carrying on, where there was this change wanted. And it was partly because we didn't listen to the company that was building for us, basically. And we didn't listen and we kept wanting things very specific. The image has to be this specific size. We want the button here. And it was never there was never like a good negotiation or consideration. And that was really rough. And same thing with like when you think about languages, the site needed to be in English, German, Japanese, all these different languages. Well, English and Latin languages, the letters are the same width and they're all about the same length and everything as far as the words go. When you get into German, the words are a lot longer. When you get into Japanese, kanji is like a double byte size character instead of a single. So all that stuff affects how the site looks, but no one would consider that either. So that caused a lot of problems too. So it's just like constant things like that where, if you hire consultants, let them consult you is the lesson.
Yeah, I tell my clients there's no point in hiring a professional if you're not going to listen to their advice. If you're just going to do whatever you think and whatever you want to do anyway, why throw your money away on a pro? The point that you're making is so salient and important and relevant because part of it is just getting the value of what you paid, but also there's this element of humility that we need to have, that we can't all be experts at everything. And the whole reason that we work with professionals is because they have expertise that we lack and we should listen. And then the professionals should be humble enough to really listen to what the client wants and let the client be the boss insofar as they can clearly articulate what problem they're trying to solve and the general approach that they believe would work that's consistent with your advice.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us just 1 to 2, just a last little question. Can you give us 1 to 2 sort of directionally correct steps that people can take as they approach their next big project to get the most out of working with a professional or a project manager on the other side?
Yeah, sure. So I think there are 2 things. One is be prepared. When you're engaging someone to work on your project, be prepared with prerequisites for them to start working. So if that's designs, if they're working with you on designs, then it should be what your vision is and what your purpose is. But if you're past that and you're getting something designed and someone's going to implement it, have the designs ready and have a timeline for when they will be ready. But you don't want someone to start working and then have to stop and things like that, because it's just going to start costing money. And then the other thing is, I recommend that people use what's called like a RACI matrix. It's RACI, and it stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And you can find these online. And basically, you can list out all the tasks or deliverables, and then you can list out who is like all on the project. And then you can say if that person for each task, are they responsible for it? Are they accountable? Are they just to be consulted or just to be informed? And that really helps, just kind of from a staffing perspective, know who all the players are and know who's going to be doing what. And that's really helpful, because then kind of gets everyone's mindset ready for contributing to the project in the way they are expected to.
That calls to my mind a previous discussion that we've had with a different podcast guest, where we talked about the value and importance of organizational charts. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't have a well fleshed out, clear organizational chart, it's going to be really difficult to use that RACI matrix, because you don't really know what zone everyone's playing. If you consider it like a zone defense, right? You don't really know, okay, well, this pertains to this person's job and their job description, their role. If everybody's kind of doing everything, then you're not going to have clear division of labor. I really appreciate you coming on to share your insight about how to get some of these things right and how people can benefit, be more efficient, more effective in working with project managers, and more profitable overall. Before you go, though, can you share, number one, how people can connect with you and how they can get the most out of that initial interaction? Obviously, we want them to go and listen to the More Than Work podcast, but what is the main channel for connecting with you, and how can they get the most out of that?
Yeah, sure. So, and thank you about the podcast. I think for this audience, for sure, More Than Work Pod, wherever you go, if you go to Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, it's More Than Work Pod is how you find the podcast. And I think just the first episode, really, you learn about me and why I started the podcast and my thoughts. And then I would say just go through and look at episodes that are intriguing to you. I mean, I have all different people that I've talked to, but I would say just give them a listen. And of course, if you like the podcast, subscribe and review and all that. But I definitely think just hearing what brought me to do it, and then hearing from whatever guests kind of resonate with you just based on their description would be great.
All right. Well, thanks again for being a guest on the Profit from Legal podcast. We're really happy to have you. Really valuable insights. It's just been a great discussion this last 25 minutes or so. But that's all for this episode of Profit from Legal. Please subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, share it with your friends, and tune in for the next episode of the Profit from Legal podcast next week. Thanks.